you haven't heard of Spotify for podcasters, it's the easiest way to create and promote your podcast. It's free. That's right, it's free to download. It has built-in tools that will allow you to record and edit your podcast from your cell phone or any smart device. Spotify for podcasters also distributes your podcast on virtually any platform that streams podcasts, like Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Apple and Google Podcasts, and much more. You can even monetize your podcast with no minimum listeners. Spotify for podcasters is your one-stop app for podcasting. Remember, it's free.
Welcome to the Trigger Warning Talk podcast, where we have uncensored conversation, we exchange information. And when I say uncensored conversation, I'm truly meaning uncensored conversation. So you might hear some adult language, you might want to put the kids to the side. These conversations are not really meant for kids because there's sometimes adult language. However, we don't censor anybody. And so what I always tell people is, if you want your kid or whoever you have in your care that's under 18 to watch and or listen to this content, because we're streaming on all major platforms, have an adult present, somebody that's 18 or older, because they may have questions, they may have some concerns. There's all kind of issues that we talk about here. So again, uncensored conversations, we exchange information, and we provide a ton of resources. If you are triggered at any point during this podcast, and I mean any point, your first point of contact is for an immediate need of help is calling 911. I'm a retired paramedic and a firefighter. We're all mandated reporters. That's where the documentation process starts. I have a very distinguished special guest that I'm going to introduce in about a minute after I get some of this housekeeping stuff out of the way, and we're going to just jump into her story. We're doing a 3-part series entitled Silence Speaks Volumes. If you need help that's not immediate and you need help with an addiction, we have a number of resources available, whether it's Al-Anon for the supporters, we have Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. We provide those numbers and websites in the show notes for every episode that we do. This podcast is going to be streaming audio and video. You will be able to watch it on Spotify as well as our YouTube channel, which is Penton Pending Consulting Solutions LLC. We're produced by that company, which is my company. We're sponsored by Spotify for podcasters. If you have, any help that you need for domestic violence or trafficking or sexually based offenses, and we also cover true crime, we provide that information for you in those resources, including RAIN, which is Rape, Abuse, Incest National Net. We'll talk more about that in part 2, because that's where we're going to dive into the domestic violence aspect. And then part 3, we're going to talk about the work that Natashah does with first responders. So that's near and dear to my heart, also being a first responder. I want to introduce Natashah Khan. Now, Natashah Khan is one of the most interesting people that I've met on social media, via social media. She has a great working relationship with a friend of mine, Portia Booker. Portia, the producer, my sister, my non-biological sister. But hey, I got more relatives than family, Natashah. That's all I'm saying. I got more relatives than family.
Really? So,
Natashah comes from the Caribbean island of Trinidad and Tobago. Is it Tobago or Tobago? I always wonder.
You're right. Tobago.
See? I should have been a linguist. That's all. That's a whole other conversation. Okay. Her parents are of Middle Eastern descent, and she was raised in the Islamic faith from birth to age 18. She's an educator, increasing awareness on addiction and removing the stigma, because you guys know I got a whole series on stigmas, taboos, and stereotypes and its negative impact on families. Natashah's a motivational speaker. She talks about abuse and neglect and abandonment and unresolved trauma, ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. We got a series on that also with Dr. Tori Williams. She talks about all kind of things in relationship to mental health. She also has earned a master's degree in counseling, psychology. She graduated cum laude. Shout out to you. Salute to you for that, because I always love and promote and highlight educated Black women. Shout out to Mama LP. And she has an expertise in business management and substance abuse and dual diagnosis, mental health patients over the past 2 decades. Now, I'm not going to age you out, so that's on you. Additionally, for the last 5 years, Natashah has been the sole developer and facilitator of Family Healing Retreat, which is a 3-day seminar focusing on familiar relationships and her clients' relationships, dynamics with their partners, their families, and individuals. She is a published author of 2 virtual articles, Understanding the Disease of Addiction and Victim to Victory. She also is a contributing writer to a virtual magazine called iShine. You guys got to watch these podcasts because I got all her stuff, her links on the screen here. You're going to miss this stuff. And she does a podcast called Getting to the Root of It on YouTube. Got to check that out. Great content. Love it to pieces. You know, we're going to jump into your story, Natashah. First and foremost, what's good with you?
First of all, thank you for having me on the show. It's truly an honor. I know it's taken us a couple months to get here, but I'm very, very grateful to be here.
We just playing tag. That's all. We're just playing tag.
So we finally caught up. Life has been good. God has been good to me. I just celebrated 12 years of sobriety on April 10th. And it has been quite a journey, but my true journey into all of this really started probably when I left home around the age of 17, 18 years old. First and foremost, I did not know that I was struggling with addiction. I didn't understand that I had mental health issues at that time in my life.
Hold on a sec. I want to reiterate that you are a podcast. So 75% of the interviews that we do, the guest is speaking. You see how she just took over? I don't
sorry.
Don't you do that. I'm just saying, folks, this is what we do. When you're a podcaster, you have that mindset. So it's like you kind of that podcaster, you're the host, but you're the producer also. I just want to say it for the record. I got you. You go ahead, because I'm just sitting back. I'm letting you do the show because this is your interview. It's my podcast, but it's your interview. You go right ahead. I just want to say that for the record. Because far from me to be the caveman, knuckle dragon, Neanderthal dinosaur in the building. You go right ahead. Tell me your story.
Feel free to stop and ask any questions that you have. No, I just, I'm so passionate about working with individuals that struggle with mental health issues and or substance abuse issues, because I spent a lot of my life not understanding that I had problems with it as well. A lot of it you mentioned with my bio that I come from the Caribbean, and a lot of cultural influences and generational influences. We didn't talk about things like depression and anxiety, and we didn't address mental health. It was not a conversation that we had when I was growing up. So when I left home, I was struggling with mental health issues, depression, anxiety, etc. However, I didn't know it was those things. I started experimenting with mind and mood altering substances around the age of 18. The first 18 years of my life, I was a straight lace, quote unquote, nerd. I made straight A's and did really well, did everything that mom and dad told me that I needed to do to live the perfect life, right? But I moved out, and of course, being around my friends and the people that I was surrounding myself with, I started, dabbling in being curious about, smoking marijuana and taking prescription pills like Xanax and Percocets and things of that nature. And it was very casual, wasn't something that I was using every day, and that progressed with time. So there was a progression of my using of mind and mood altering substances, which then took me to a place of using alcohol as a means to cope and other substances as a means to cope. And I'm kind of giving you an abbreviated version because there's so much that went into all of that. But it's my journey in active addiction, realizing that I was an addict, realizing that I had mental health and substance abuse issues, and being able to have overcome that. Because 13 years ago, I attempted suicide, and I was really ready to tap out and, not be of this world anymore. The God of my understanding said he wasn't done with me and had other plans. So the last 12 years have been an opportunity to, I get a redo, I guess, if you want to put it that way. And I get an opportunity to give back to other people who are sick and suffering and that are struggling and don't even know what they're struggling with, to be able to help them.
You see this book? You see how these tabs, Natashah? See, y'all got to watch these podcast interviews. I got all kind of notes here. I got one question with 27 parts, but Mrs. LP doesn't like when I do that. So I'm going to consolidate those 27 parts down to about 5. You said that, let's start with the suicide attempt, because for me, being a first responder, that's been one of the hardest things that I've had to deal with, and that I deal with, and that most first responders deal with in their career. We know that the job inherently has risks, and also we know that the job deals with a lot of trauma. When I got an EMS in 2006, I was 37. I'm 52 now. I didn't realize how much mental health crisis played a part in EMS. I would say approximately 40% of your EMS calls or higher are mental health related, because you can break down EMS calls in 2 categories: medical or trauma. Your trauma is going to be your cuts, gunshots, car accidents. Your medical is going to be your heart attacks, your strokes, your diabetes issues, your mental health issues. I came up with this quote. I say mental health crisis is the world's oldest continuous pandemic that's been around since the beginning of mankind, and it's not going anywhere. Until you deal with the stigmas, the taboos, and the stereotypes, the pain, the judgment, the trauma, all of those things, you're going to have people experiencing all kind of traumas, starting young, as you talked about, ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Again, we covered that in a 3-part series in December with a national ACEs expert, another Black woman who has a doctorate. I don't play when it comes to Black women being highlighted, because the Black woman is the most disrespected person on the planet, especially in this country. And so I want to do my part to 180 that visual. You talk about your suicide attempt. How old were you when this happened?
20, well, I first started having suicidal ideation when I was 14, 15, but my attempt to take my life, I was about 29.
What is that mindset like? Because I know for me, either when we get the call, it's either the person made an attempt or plural, or I have to pronounce them because they were successful, unfortunately. For you making the attempt, what's going on in your mind that says, you know what, the world would be better without my physical presence, my soul in my physical presence?
Sure. So let me first start off by saying that, I have heard for years people say that those that take their own lives are very self-centered. And I can appreciate and understand how someone from the outside looking in can have that perspective. I can respect that. There was a lot at that time that was going on in my life. My 13-year marriage was coming to an end. I had learned that my husband had had an affair and has been going on for quite some time. I was in the middle of now a divorce where he was now battling for custody of our daughters. So we had just moved to Florida a couple years before, so I'd lost our house that we had built together. I'm not near my family. I'm not near my support system that I'd had. We moved to Texas with the intent to be closer to his family and to have more of a support system. But once he was having his affair, his family knew about it, and whatever little support I was getting started to become a little bit disjointed, right? And rightfully so. That was his family. They were not my family per se. So it was a very trying time. I was also working as a forensics investigator for sex crimes, which is a very daunting job. I mean, I loved my job, but very stressful, very demanding. So what happened, what led to this was when it came down to the final court ruling, it was that I worked too much and I worked too many long hours, and I was not able to provide the stability, the 9-to-5 stability that my children had needed at the time. And with him moving in with his girlfriend, partner, whatever we want to refer her as, the family court saw that as a 2-person household versus me being a single mother and not being able to provide that stability. And only on those grounds alone, the state of Texas actually awarded him primary custody of our daughters. And that was devastating to me, because prior to knowing what was going on with him outside of our marriage, I was the soccer mom. I was the mom that made sure the girls, I took the girls to school every day. I did everything that mom needed to do for her kids while being a full-time, employee, and being a full-time wife, and being domesticated, and everything that I was raised and told that I needed to do to have the perfect and happy family. And now everything that I had built was just starting to, like a domino effect, it just all started, tumbling down, one thing after the other. When the final ruling came down, my children had to live with their dad, and I did not get primary custody of them. And that really took my depression to a whole other level. I grew increasingly sad. I felt very lost. I was telling you off camera earlier a lot about identity. I placed my identity in the role of being a mother and being a wife and being a good employee, and performing in my job. And I was a performer for everybody. And that's where my identity lied. So when all these things started, I started losing these things in my life. Pieces of my identity was going along with it because I was attached to these things. So there came this point where I just didn't know who I was. I was not a mother. In my eyes, I was not a mother because I couldn't fight to get my kids. I didn't have the money for an attorney. I had a pro bono attorney at the time that was representing me. I was no longer a wife, was no longer good enough. I mean, these were the limiting beliefs, and these were the negative things that was going on in my mind that continued to just increase the depression. And it got to a point where it became so dark for me. It's like, well, what's the point of being alive? I've lost the house. I have to leave my job because I can't function. As a first responder in the type of work that I was doing, I couldn't manage. I couldn't manage what was going on personally and still go out there and do the job that I needed to do to the best of my ability. And now, so I don't have the husband, I don't have the kids, and I don't have anything. So I felt very alone. I felt very lost and feeling like I have no identity now. And as a result of just not knowing who I was anymore, with all those things being taken from you or being removed from my life, I did. And I was just telling a friend this because I lost a friend to the disease of addiction just a week ago. And I remember saying, my children are better off without me. And I truly, truly, in that moment, believed that. And people will say, well, that's very self-centered. You had 2 kids, you would take your life and leave them. In those moments when you are in your darkness, when you are depressed, when you are broken, when you are lost, when you are confused, and you have all these emotions coming at you, and you don't have healthy coping skills to help manage them, my go-to was drinking. And what I did was I took almost a bottle of trazodone, 100 milligrams, and made a concoction with that and liquor. And I'm very blessed today to be alive. But in that moment in time in my life, I thought it was going to be the best alternative for everyone. So it's interesting you asked that question, and I find that hard, to explain that, because there's so much judgment, and you had said that earlier. There's so much judgment around when people take their lives, and I always say that unless you are in someone's shoes, and unless you are walking their walk, I encourage people not to be so highly opinionated and are judgmental of others, because you just do not know what the depths of the pain that individual is going through. And I'm not saying that it's right. And I'm not saying that taking my life, and if I was successful, that leaving 2 children behind was the right thing to do. But at that time in my life, that is all that I could think about.
This is the Trigger Warning Talk podcast. We're sponsored by Spotify for Podcasters. We are produced by my company, Penton Consulting Solutions, LLC. We're streaming on all major platforms. You can also watch these interviews on Spotify, the free version, so you don't have to pay, as well as our YouTube channel, which is Penton Consulting Solutions, LLC. We're talking with our distinguished guest and friend, Natashah Khan. She has a master's degree in counseling. She's talking about her life and her journey with her personal issues with addiction, suicidal ideation, being involved in a very, very traumatic divorce. I've been there. I've gone through a lot of those same things that you went through. We're doing this 3-part series called Silence Speaks Volumes: Addiction, Identity, and Recovery. I want to talk about the silence part, because for me, again, being a first responder, when I've shown up on the scene and we had to pronounce somebody because they were successful in their suicidal ideation attempt. The cops are there. They're looking around for anything, including the tool or whatever was used, whether it was drugs, alcohol, a weapon, or what have you. They're also looking for evidence of what caused this person to maybe go that route. They're looking for journals. They're looking for diaries. They're looking for letters. They're looking for anything that stands out that would give them a clue to first rule out that it was a homicide, to why this person chose to take their own life. And what we find in those situations when a diary or a letter or a journal was found, a lot of times is the silence. They didn't tell anybody that they were going through these problems. Nobody was aware that they were having these issues. Look at the breaking news stories that you see with these celebrities. Twitch from the Ellen DeGeneres show. The woman from North Carolina who was a contestant in a beauty pageant, who had been a media personality. Robin Williams, all of these different celebrities and famous folks that have taken their lives, they were suffering in silence. Some were getting mental help, some weren't. But it's the silence that always stands out to me. Will you talk to us about that?
So let's go before the silence.
Okay.
Things silence us for a reason. It's interesting because the name of my business is called Empowered Voices, and I'm all about breaking that silence and encouraging and empowering people to speak up.
Yeah.
Because when we experience whatever that traumatic experience is, everything becomes fear-based. We are immediately in fear for our lives. We are scared. And a lot of the things that are external of us has an influence, and it will help determine whether we are going to be vocal about what has happened to us. Right. And so what I mean by that is if there's people are highly opinionated and people are highly judgmental, or have their own opinions or their things to say of what they think should or shouldn't happen, all of that plays a part in when we're going through something, whether or not we're going to tell about it or not.
Okay.
Now, before we talk about silence, you talk about silence and I'm thinking about science. And we have to understand that in part, there is a chemical imbalance in our brain. There is a deficiency in the development of the prefrontal cortex. There's a lot of things that is going on physiologically with us that also plays a part. Like there are multiple contributing factors that are biological, psychological, environmental, and spiritual that all come together that leads us to that place of calling it quits and tapping out. Right? It's not necessarily one isolated incident. It could have been a series of things that have been going on for a really, really long time. And what I have found in my field of study and with the clients that I work with and with my own personal experience, we are silenced because we have fear. We have a lot of shame. Sometimes, depending upon what has happened to us, there is a lot of guilt. So guilt, shame, fear of being emotionally overwhelmed and holding on and harnessing all of that emotional pain that comes with that experience, that in itself silences us. Then you look around you and you think of the environment in which you're in, and how are people going to look at me? What are people going to say? Are people going to believe me? When I worked in sex crimes, I was trained to be a forensics interviewer to learn specifically how to investigate sex crimes with minors and learning a very particular way on how to interview. And the reason why I want to bring that up, and that's so important, we have to be careful as first responders and or families when our loved ones have endured something, how we approach them and how we communicate with them about what's going on. Because how we approach them and how we communicate, meaning if we are coming off opinionated, being suggestive, if we are suggesting that they may be at fault or they may be partly to blame, or whatever that might look like, how we communicate with them will also have an impact on that silence as well. So I do think there's a lot of different reasons and a lot of different contributing factors to our silence. And that silence causes us to harness all of that emotional pain. The prefrontal cortex that is deficient, that is not developed appropriately, when overwhelmed, the brain actually shuts off from the prefrontal cortex and we go into survival mode.
Okay.
So anyone who has ever endured any kind of trauma, right, the brain goes into survival mode as a means to protect us. In addition, the maturation and development of the brain now gets stunted. So we hear all the time how when you use drugs and alcohol, the brain is stunted. Well, the same is true for trauma. And every person that struggles with a substance abuse issue has a mental health issue, i.e. trauma issue. So
That's
the
right.
brain was actually stunted and the development and the maturation of the brain was already hindered way before drugs and alcohol came into the picture, right? So now the person's operating from the survival part of their brain. Well, the common behaviors we're going to see from someone who's in survival mode is someone who is obsessive, compulsive, impulsive, and highly manipulative. Now, there are many other behaviors, but these are some of the primary we'll see because it's almost kill or be killed, so to speak, right? We are in a survival mindset, so we are functioning from a survival position. And that's what a lot of people fail to realize. We've got a lot of people in this world that has unresolved trauma and think that life is all great. In reality, they're not living and they're not thriving. They're operating, they're making decisions based on the being on the survival part of their brain and all of the unwanted emotions that they're harnessing. If I am filled with fear, if I'm filled with guilt and shame, then the decisions that I make for my life or the life of someone else is going to be driven by the emotional pain that I harness. So I've got to learn on how to release myself of that emotional pain so that I can begin to make healthier decisions for myself.
What's your view on AA, NA, and Al-Anon?
I love it. Alcoholics Anonymous saved my life. When no one else understood me, and when there was all these stigmas and judgments and opinions, even coming directly from my family and friends who were like, "Oh, you're an addict," or where did that come from, or how did that happen? Because we don't drink and do drugs, so how did that happen for you? I can very easily walk into Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, and I hate to say this, well, I'd love to say this, but hate it for my family, but it felt like home. And I've always said AA was a pseudo family to me because they were there to help me shake off the shame and shake off the guilt and shake off what other people might think of me. And I found a place where people understood what I was going through. Right. So I do promote AA a lot. Now, it's not for everyone. Not everyone loves AA. Not everyone loves NA. But there's so many different types of programs that are out there today that can help us. We just have to be willing to accept that we have a problem, and we have to accept that we're powerless over people, places, and things, and be able to seek help and seek the support to help turn our lives over.
What are your thoughts about those that you said it's not for everyone? Would you explain that briefly? What you mean by that?
For instance, I'm going to use Alcoholics Anonymous. In its 12 steps, it speaks a lot of God. So individuals who may have their trauma, their religious trauma or traumas related to God, or maybe they are resistant or they've turned their way from God or just don't believe, coming into an AA meeting, the minute they see God, they're like, oh, this is a cult. This is all about for God and we're not for that. So we're going to leave. Right.
Okay.
But there are other programs, and I know like there's a Dharma program as well. I know NAMI has also other programs that are not necessarily 12-step based that will also help individuals be able to identify and process what they're going through. And so they don't feel like, I personally don't feel through AA that God has been forced onto me. It was an opportunity to discover a relationship, a more intimate relationship with a higher power. And that is how it's referenced in the meetings. But again, the people that tend to shy away from it, it's because of trauma that they've experienced in their lives. Some people just aren't ready. Some people aren't ready to go into that room and have to admit that they're powerless over mind and mood altering substances, right? For AA, it's the alcoholic. For NA, it's, someone that is dealing with, have abused drugs or misused drugs. So sometimes our lack of willingness to admit that we're powerless and that we need help is just one thing that can deter someone from the room.
And NAMI is the National Association on Mental Illness, and they are a great organization, and they provide a ton of resources for all things related to mental health. Let me jump into the next thing that I want to talk to you about, because I just have such an admiration for people who say, you know what, if I got a problem, I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to do what I need to do to overcome it. And I want to help others overcome whatever their issues are. Let's go back to AA. How do you feel about amends? Because I know that's part of the 12 steps. What's your view on that? Because, and I'll tell you why. Mrs. LP is recovering from alcoholism, and she's very open about that. And she talked about on one of the steps she had to make amends, and she said that, if she had to do it all over again, she would do her amends different, because you can do living amends, you can do monetary amends, different like that. Mm-hmm. Some of the people that traumatized her, she didn't do those alternative things, and it set her back somewhat.
Sure.
She's dealing with that because she's doing EMDR, which is, she's been doing that for almost 2 years now, and it's been phenomenal. Like, it's been like,
yeah, I love it.
Like life. And if you have not heard of EMDR, if you don't know what EMDR, and you have PTSD or CPTSD, I'm telling you, life changing. And we also highlight metaphysicians and metaphysical modalities. I've interviewed a ton of people that are Reiki practitioners, NLP, EFT, the tapping.
100%. And it works amazing with military veterans and first responders. It is such a breakthrough to help them take down the walls that they have built in order for them to address their issues. Everything that you've just mentioned, working in inpatient treatment, we have offered those services, in the different places I've worked. And we have seen so many breakthroughs with first responders, and I loved it. And I've personally done EMDR myself multiple times for multiple traumas in my life. And it is key. It is vital to your healing.
You see what she just did? See, that's the producer part. She didn't already jump to part 3. We're still in part 1, but that's good. See, I love that about you, Natasha. I want you to go back to the question that I asked you about, which is the amends. What do you say about that? Because that, to me, is the difference between healing and staying in trauma. How do you feel about the amends portion of the 12-step program? From a person that was addicted, as well as a person who is a professional.
So I love amends. I think that amends need to be seen very differently from apologies. I was just having this conversation in a group that I was facilitating yesterday, where most families are wanting an apology. They've destroyed our families. They've done X, Y, and Z, and I'm waiting for an apology, and I can't believe they won't apologize. And the amends is not that. The amends is not about apology. It's an opportunity for us to take ownership and be accountable for the things that we've done and the things that we remember. And I say that because as a recovering alcoholic, I've had blackouts in my time where I don't recall certain things that have happened, but other people have recalled it, right?
Yes.
So I love the amends process. I will say, for anybody in their first year of doing this, I know for me, making my amends was a bit scary. But I had a sponsor that walked me through it and taught me that, my family needed this amends. But I didn't do the amends. One of the things she taught me was not to go in with expectations. So I had to learn to manage my expectations when making my amends. And what that means is, just because you're making an amends does not mean that the person on the receiving end of that is necessarily going to be welcoming, would be necessarily willing to show grace, mercy, and or forgiveness for you making an amends. The amends is for you, the individual, to own your side of the street, to clear your side of the street, and to share with the individual what you're willing to do moving forward to not continue with those old behaviors or those old attitudes. right? And like you said, there's different ways to do that. You can do that directly, you can do that indirectly, you can do it through a letter. It's important for us to get closure, because if we don't get closure, then what happens is we will at times still experience emotional pain from those past experiences. And again, we're back to now still harnessing that pain. And if we're harnessing the pain, then we're keeping ourselves sick. And that can then become an internal trigger to why we go back out to using mind and mood altering substances. So I think the amends is very necessary, but one of the beautiful things about 12 steps is that it's a step process. You can't get to 2 till you do 1. You can't get to 3 till you do 2, and so on and so forth. So by the time that you get to step 9, there's a lot of different things that you've done. In the very first step, I'm admitting that I'm powerless over mind and mood altering substances. 2, I've made a decision and come to believe a power greater than myself. Right. In my third step, I'm turning my will, my need to control people, places, and things over to the will of God as I understand Him. So as I go through all of these steps, by the time I get to 9, I'm not going to say it's easy, because it's still a little bit scary, but you have the support of the men and or women within your 12-step program and your sponsor that's going to be there to support you and carry you through that process. And I know for me in my first year, I wasn't ready to make amends to some people. So I made a list of those I was kind of my immediate people I needed to make an amends to. And in the following year, I went back and did my step work all over again as I was sponsoring someone. And I went back and made an amends to people that I didn't make the first year.
Okay.
Right? So I'm a big believer. I am 12 years sober. And every time I sponsor and I take someone through the steps, I go through the steps myself. And so if there's anyone I may have forgotten somewhere, somehow, through the years, I've gone back and made those amends, because I need to clear my conscience. I'm not going to hold on. And I have to forgive. And that's another thing that I talk about and I work with clients on, is learning to forgive yourself. You have to show yourself grace, show yourself some mercy, and forgive yourself for your wrongdoings. Because if you don't forgive yourself, you're going to continue to struggle. And again, that can contribute to you going back out and having a relapse.
Which brings us to our final segment.
And so if there's anyone I may have forgotten somewhere, somehow, through the years, I've gone back and made those amends, because I need to clear my conscience. I'm not going to hold on. And I have to forgive. And that's another thing that I talk about and I work with clients on, is learning to forgive yourself. You have to show yourself grace, show yourself some mercy, and forgive yourself for your wrongdoings. Because if you don't forgive yourself, you're going to continue to struggle. And again, that can contribute to you going back out and having a relapse.
Which brings us to our final segment with you. We'll call it the shameless plug segment. But before we get to all of that, I got one more question, well, 2 more questions. Since we're talking about the 12-step program for AA, do you believe that the way that the 12-step program is constructed, what would you change, add, or do different?
To the 12 steps?
Yes.
Absolutely nothing, because the 12 steps, so behind each step is a spiritual principle, right? The first one is honesty. The second one is hope. The third one is faith. The fourth one is courage, right? And my favorite number 7 is humility. If you practice each of those spiritual principles in all of your affairs in your life, you would be a healthier, more balanced individual. And I recommend it for anyone that's not an addict or identify as, or I shouldn't say identify because it's not an identity, but knows whether or not they have addiction. Addiction is an illness. It is a dual diagnosis illness. It is a mental health and a substance abuse issue, right? So let's take addiction off the table for just 60 seconds. Any human being that can learn to be honest and be hopeful and have courage and walk in faith and trust in a higher power and have integrity and love their fellow man and do service work, have that willingness to continue to own your side of the street. And when you're wrong, you very quickly admit that you're wrong, and then you correct your behavior. Just think of the world we would live in and just think about how differently we as people would be functioning. And I've said that from the very first time that I learned about the 12 steps. It's something I teach my daughters. Now, my daughters have the risk of becoming addicted to to something, but due to years of education and their environment and what I've done for them and how I've influenced their lives, I've been very blessed that my children are not addicted to drugs and alcohol, right? One's a little codependent, but we're working through that in her life. But I teach the 12 steps to my girls, right? And as a result of them learning the 12 steps and practicing those spiritual principles in their lives, they're 21 and 25. And I'm pretty proud of the young women that they are. They're pretty healthy and well balanced, a lot more healthy and balanced than I was when I was their age. You know what I mean? So I love it, and I wouldn't change a thing about it.
Here's one of my final questions. I actually got two, but I'm gonna keep it concise. Like I said, for you being a professional in mental health, what would you say are the best modalities, Western and metaphysical, that help you deal with addictions? I know we talked about some, but like if you had a list of the top 5, what would you say? And in any order, it doesn't have to be from most important to whatever.
That's such an interesting question because I'm very eclectic. And I think it really depends on the individual and what they're willing to try and what they're willing to practice. In my bio, I talked about being raised in the Islamic faith. Today, I'm very much a believer in a higher power. I do believe in Jesus Christ, and I do believe in the Holy Spirit. But I have studied Hinduism, I've studied Islam, I've studied Judaism, I've studied Christianity, I've studied Buddhism. And I'm very eclectic because I practice a little bit of everything from each of those major religions. I practice yoga. I do meditation every morning for about an hour and a half, which is, I've worked to get there. I didn't start there. It took me a minute to get there, right? But these are the things that I'm willing to try different things to see what works. This is not a cookie cutter program or a thing for people to do. It's about you taking a journey to discover your own identity, what works for you, not what people tell you works for you, but what works for you. In the very beginning, I took the suggestions. I had to take the suggestions because in the very beginning, getting sober, listening to my own advice or listening to what I had to say always landed me in some kind of trouble. So coming into sobriety, I learned to take those suggestions. And as I moved through the program and as I was getting sober, I started exploring other avenues. I mean, for trauma, for therapy, I love EMDR. I love DBT therapy. I love, of course, your cognitive behavioral therapy, which is CBT therapy. I love motivational interviewing. So those and some of those metaphysical stuff that you were talking about earlier, they have like brain paint, they have biofeedback. Those are all different great therapeutic modalities that helps individuals that are struggling. With regards to the recovery and spiritual aspect of it, I love NA, I love AA. There's also CODA for individuals who find themselves in toxic relationships and codependent relationships. It's called Codependent Anonymous. Adults who were raised by alcoholics, but maybe they don't use substances today. It's called ACOA, Adult Children of Addicts. Is also, there's something for everybody. Right? So it's about us doing our research. I think we've spent so much of our lives listening to everybody else and allowing ourselves to be influenced by everyone and everything around us that we've stopped doing our homework. We've stopped doing the research. There's a great book by Don Miguel Ruiz called The Four Agreements that was introduced to me in the first year of my recovery. And one of the things that he says in the first step of the Four Agreements, or the first agreement, he says that 98% of what we believe is a lie.
Wow.
98%. And why? Because what we believe to be true stems from what other people have told us or how we were influenced by things external of ourselves. Right? If you think a lot of when we're children, we're like a sponge and we absorb what everyone tells us. We don't know any different, right? We're relying on our caretakers and we're like, all right, well, if they said it, it must be true. If they're doing it and getting away with it, then I guess I could do it and get away with it too. And we begin to absorb that. And we don't, as we get older, we're no longer curious. We're no longer asking questions. We almost become robotic and we just begin to say, well, yeah, I do that because, my mom did that and my grandma did that and my auntie did that and this one did that. And it's like, well, it might have worked for them, But the question remains is it working for you? And is it working for you today? And if it's not working for you, are you willing to do your homework? Are you willing to do the research? And are you willing to do something different? And that's one of the things that has helped me in my journey is not believing everything that's been told to me, but I do my homework first before making a decision.
Last question for part one, and I'm going to let you get out of here. If you could write a letter or an email to little Natashah, at whatever age under 18, what would you say?
Well, I've done so much work around that. It's so crazy, the questions that you're asking me. It's actually questions I give to my clients because I have my clients connect with their younger selves because it's so important. That part of us that feels empty will never be filled by anything external of us. You have to get in relationship. You have to get connected to that younger you. You have to figure out where you left her, right? And you need to go find her. And you've got to learn to nurture her. You've got to learn to love her and, take care of her, guide her, comfort her, celebrate her. And so I do that today, right? I work 4 days a week for 12 hours and then Friday, Saturdays, and Sundays, it's my time for me and little Natashah to play, right? So my letter to her today is, I love you. You are a strong young woman and you've made some mistakes, but it's okay. It's made you stronger. And we're going to continue walking through life together because you'll never be alone ever again.
Natashah Khan, folks. We're going to put a pin in it. We're going to pick it up for part 2 in our series called Silence Speaks Volumes. We talked about addiction, identity, and recovery. Her journey, her story. I know it was brief, but you know what? She's an author. Get her works. I got her links on the screen. I'm going to put them in the show notes here. Natashah Khan, much love to you, my sister. Again, we got more relatives than family. And we're going to embrace those that are our family, especially those that are not biological. And we're going to continue to create great content. I was just waiting for the moves and the trips that we both were taking because, we both had stuff going on in these last months. But we got all that out the way. And I knew once we came together, we're just going to do some great work together. The next part 2 in our series, we're going to be talking about the work that you do with domestic violence. Some of it's going to tie into the sex crimes work that you do. And then part 3, like I said, we're going to talk about the work that you do with first responders and all of those issues. Natashah Khan, you're always welcome to come back. Peace and blessings be upon you until next time. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Take care. We're going to jump into our final part, which is our missing persons cases that we always do. Natashah's going to go ahead and drop off because I know she got a pre-scheduled thing that she does because, again, she's a workaholic like we all are over here. Bye, Natashah. LP
Bye,
out.
guys.
We want to thank Natashah for the work that she does with mental health. And we're going to jump into our last segment, which is our true crime missing persons cases. As you all know, Mrs. LP is the one that gives us these missing person cases. But you know what? I said, I'm going to find a missing persons case this time. I'm going to give Mrs. LP a very well-deserved break. I should restate that. I'm not going to give her anything. She takes whatever break she wants. I'm going to pick this week's or this episode's missing person case. This week's missing person case comes from the Charlie Project, one of our favorite resources. This young man, Joseph Hurtado, he's been missing since September 9th of 1974 from El Paso, Texas. The classification is non-family abduction. Sex is male, race Hispanic, according to the Charlie Project. I'm just reading. Date of birth is January 5th, 1973, which makes him 50 years old. He was 1 year old at the time of his disappearance. Height and weight is 2 feet 6 inches, 22 pounds. He was wearing a red jumper, blue socks, and brown high-top orthopedic shoes. Medical conditions: Joseph was born with club feet. He was wearing the above-mentioned orthopedic shoes at the time he vanished to help correct the problem. If left untreated, club feet can lead to severe in-toeing or pigeon toes later in life. He was last seen in a blue Ford, and distinguishing characteristics, again, according to the Charlie Project: Hispanic male, brown hair, brown eyes, Joseph has a brown birthmark on his back near his right kidney. Details of his disappearance. Joseph was last seen walking to his grandmother's house in the 800 block of Elmwood Court in El Paso, Texas on September 9, 1974. Joseph's mother was washing the family's car in their driveway at the time, and his father was indoors. Joseph kept going from one parent to the other. When he disappeared, at first both of his parents thought he was with the other one. He has never been seen again. All of his neighbors and his parents, who are now divorced, were ruled out as suspects in his case. And a search of the Rio Grande River, which flows behind his house, turned up no clues. A neighbor reported seeing an unidentified blue Ford on the street, which dead ends at the time Joseph was last seen. The vehicle disappeared at the same time Joseph did, but it has not been proven that the car is connected to his presumed abduction. Authorities believe Joseph is dead, and they have a suspect, whom they have not publicly named, in his kidnapping and presumed murder. They presented their case to a grand jury, but the jury didn't issue any indictments. Police stated the passage of time since Joseph's disappearance has greatly hindered their investigation. The case remains active but unsolved. If you have any information about the whereabouts, good, bad, ugly, or indifferent, of Joseph Hurtado, contact El Paso County Sheriff's Office at 915-546-2291. Again, if you have any information about the whereabouts, good, bad, ugly, or indifferent, about Joseph Hurtado, contact the El Paso County Sheriff's Office at 915-546-2291. You can also go to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the Texas Department of Public Safety, the El Paso Times has an article, and the El Paso Herald Post has information about this case. I will post a link to this story in the show notes, as well as other links to our guest who was gracious to join us for part 1. Live in awareness, never live in fear. Make sure you keep your head on swivel, because it's not a matter of if, but when and where a violent critical incident is going to happen, whether it's at a house of worship, an educational, academic institution, a business. It could be at a shopping mall. It could be at a venue. It could be at a concert. Violence happens anywhere and everywhere. All violence starts here in the mind. Again, mental health crisis is the world's oldest continuous pandemic that's been around since the beginning of mankind. Take a first aid, CPR, stop the bleed course. I offer those. I network with people that offer those classes. Let's get back to our humanity. LP out.